So hello and welcome to our March coffee chat. It's really great to see so many of you here today. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Mari Rystan and I'm the marketing director and product manager of IrisBG. Eivind Rystan, who's the founder of and CEO of IrisBG, is also here today. Today we will hear from Julie Rotramel. She's the plant recorder at Cuba Center in Delaware, and she kindly accepted my invitation to talk about how they work with propagation at their garden. This is a topic that has been requested by many of you, so we are super excited to have it on our agenda for today. Julie will go through 3 scenarios and how they currently handle them, and then she has a set of questions for us to look at together. Before I give the word to Julie, just a few words on the coffee chats. The idea with these sessions is that we at IrisBG would like to offer you a space where you can connect with peers and have a chat about IrisBG and issues that may arise through the work with your collection. These sessions won't have a fixed format, and you as a community can influence how they will evolve. In this session, we will try out an open discussion without breakout rooms, so we really hope that will work out well. Sometimes we may present more than one challenge or perhaps a demo of IrisBG tips and tricks. Please let us know what you're interested in. Get in touch with me if you would like to present a challenge. It can be big or small, or if you have any suggestions for improvements. And hopefully you will make some new connections here today, and together we might become a bit wiser. So this map shows the locations of everyone that has registered for today. I've not taken home offices into account, so this probably isn't completely accurate. And to fully learn a bit more about who's here today, we have created a tiny poll. The first question is related to your experience with IrisBG. And the second question is from Julie, who's wondering how you track your propagations. As usual, we have like a nice mix of experience levels in IrisBG. And it doesn't really matter if you're new or if you don't track your propagations, but it seems like many of you are. And nice to see that some are using IrisBG only as well. All right, without any further ado, please welcome Julie Rotramel.
All right, well, good morning and afternoon, and I guess evening to some of you. I'm looking forward to talking about propagations today and how we record them at Cuba Center. I'm planning to start with just an overview of our propagation efforts and the data we track, and then we'll get into some of our trickier recording scenarios. We all use the database slightly differently, maybe very differently, but I think it's immensely helpful to hear these different perspectives when we're trying to solve problems that can be so in the weeds, and we are going to get into the weeds, so I hope everyone has coffee. All right, so a brief introduction to propagations. All of our incoming plant material starts out of the greenhouse. So whether it's designated as a planting or as a propagation item. So this kind of acts as a gatekeeper for our records management and ensures that all of our plant material is accounted for and entered into the database. So as a result, not only does our greenhouse team manage plant material from seeds to cuttings to up-potted plants purchased from nurseries, they manage the flow of non-propagated plant material, what we call plantings, into and out of the garden. So for some fun stats, this past year, our greenhouse received over 18,000 plants, over 6,000 of which were propagations. 8,530 plants were transferred to the garden from the greenhouse. About half of those were propagations. Some of these plants are used to bulk up garden planting displays, add new interest to the gardens, support our trial garden research, or are planted out into our natural lands to supplement existing populations. Over 7,000 plants were sold to our garden visitors, and 2,000 of which were propagations. We sent over 2,500 propagations to outside organizations, and this includes plants grown from seed for local and regional conservation projects, plants grown and shared with native plant nurseries, and donations to support research at other institutions. One thing that all of these propagations have in common is that they are recorded in IRIS. So this helps us track who requested the plant material, record our provenance information, link related documents, and create a propagation history to follow how a plant moves through the greenhouse and into the garden and beyond. So the foundation for our propagation record keeping is in our item statuses. We have a specific list of statuses for propagations, and we tried to keep them as short as possible to make generating reports efficient and informative. Many of these statuses are waypoints in a propagation's life cycle, such as seed sown, spore sown, or first potting. Others are more general, such as moved, but the details tell us something useful when looking at a propagation history. One question we have asked a lot when crafting our propagation definitions and lists is, what information do we need to create a propagation protocol? We tailored our treatment, environment, and medium fields to be as informative and consistent as possible. That's really important. The field list contents are edited only by the propagation manager. Similarly, with our container field lists, we have a predefined selection of container sizes so that the list can be replicated outside of the database in other workflows. So this allows us a seamless transition between workflows inside and outside of the database. From the start of our time with Iris, we've relied heavily on the accession item type to distinguish between different subsets of our living collection. So in this slide, you can see the 3 accession item types we use are heavily integrated, which is why we didn't want to create separate collections for each. Propagations become plantings when they enter the garden, or they become natural lands items when they're outplanted in our natural areas. Plants from our gardens then are also brought into the greenhouses to be propagated. So we needed a fluid way to track all of these plants crossing collection boundaries, and this seemed like the way that worked best for us. And now we're stuck with it. So here's an example, just to illustrate this, of an accession that started as wild collected seed. So this came in as a propagation. We sowed the seed on 2 separate occasions. So that's where the propagation items A and B come from. Eventually, the plugs that were grown from seed were planted in natural lands as natural lands item C. They were also planted in 4 separate locations in the garden as planting items D through G. Since we track things differently for each of these areas and make separate reports for each of those areas, it's incredibly helpful for us to have a defined item type for each one. So we'll start with our first scenario. And that is when we track germination data. So I spoke with our greenhouse manager about this, and a lot of our data is tracked in spreadsheets and then later on input into the database. So my goal is to make Iris a useful resource for capturing this information in real time. So right now we have several propagation item statuses that capture germination data. So seed sown is the starting date for a propagation event. Germination then tracks the date that the very first seedlings are observed. Germination count marks the date when germination percentage is calculated based on the number of seeds sown and the number of seedlings observed. So these 3 statuses are really important for us to track because they give us an indication of how effective a propagation protocol is or how viable a batch of seed was. So other metrics are calculated during the time that germination count takes place, such as days to germination and days to germination count. This is a lot of great information that we capture, but in the database, if we don't have very specific statuses to mark events and counts, information ends up being masked into a comments box that later on has to be dissected apart. And you can see that in this slide. This is a lot of shorthand written here that our propagation manager entered into the database, and not everyone's going to be able to interpret that. It's a jumble, you might say. So this is our first scenario, and I want to stop for a moment just to see if anyone has questions about how we track germination.
I had a quick question. My name's Rebecca Blankweiss. I work at the San Francisco Botanical Garden. And first of all, this is amazing. I'm so excited. So being able to label these different categories, propagation, natural lands, there was a comment that said you need a special module Can you explain that a little bit more, the preserved material module?
Maybe I should jump in and answer that because it was my comment, and it's related to have you configure IrisBG. So as you may or may not know, you can have IrisBG as your standard module, and then you can have extra modules added on depending on how you would like to use IrisBG. So many people would use the preserved material module as an add-on if they have an herbarium, for instance, or work with DNA tissues or anything, but you can also use it as they've done here at the Cuba Center.
Thank you.
There's no more questions. At this point, I want us to read the following discussion questions and then put them in the back of your mind for now. So my thought is maybe pick one, since there's a lot of us here. Pick one to think about during the presentation, and then at the end, during our group discussion, share your thoughts on that question, since we want to have a discussion on all of them. So number one, what information is important to capture to track germination? Two, how can we use IrisBG to best or better store this information? How do you use IrisBG to track your germination differently? And three, how can reports be used to pull out germination information in a more usable format? Okay, on to our next scenario. So we want to discuss reliably auditing plant movement from the greenhouse to the gardens. So this one, we are going to get into some very specific workflows that we have at Mount Cuba. So buckle up. We rely on several different processes to make sure that plant material is successfully transitioning in our records from a propagation to a planting or a natural lands item. So the first thing our greenhouse manager does is updates items in the greenhouse with a temporary available item status. This allows him to generate an availability report, which is sent to horticulture staff each week to let them know what is ready to plant out. So when horticulture staff then take plants from the greenhouse, they're required to sign out plant material on a physical copy of this availability report. So they indicate the number they take, the location the plants are planted, the date, and their name. This information is entered into the database with one of 4 statuses, depending on whether it was from a propagation item or a planting item. So I'll go through each of these scenarios in the next few slides. So the first 2 statuses that we're covering are unique to planting items. So signed out status is entered for a planting item if all of the remaining plant material has been taken from the greenhouse. If horticulture staff don't submit any planting information on their monthly plant change forms, this status can be audited by running an items report on the signed out item status. So I typically change signed out to planted when I enter notes from the horticulturists. So any instance of a signed out status that shows up means that the planting information wasn't written up, and I will follow up then with staff to reconcile the data, find out where those plants were planted. So I don't have any good examples of this in action, but when I did run the audit report for this presentation, I came up with a list of items that still have signed out status somewhere in the record. None of these were missed in plant change write-ups, but there were errors on my end where I forgot to update signed out to planted, or the greenhouse used signed out instead of a different status. So it's a good reminder for me that these reports and audits can help me do my work better too. So the next status is split. So this is entered for a planting item if there are remaining plants in the greenhouse. So in this example on the screen, the solidago was in the greenhouse and then was split apart. 4 plants were removed and planted in the trial garden. So I received a plant change form from our trial garden manager with his planting notes, and then created a new planting item, which is B, for the new mass of plants. And whenever I create this new item from the propagation or from the greenhouse planting, we use the item reference to indicate that the new planting came from the greenhouse location. So if planting information wasn't submitted on a plant change form, like this last status, we could run a report on the split status. And this status does remain in our item history. So we would just have to sort through the resulting report to see where comments are empty. And if they are, then I'd follow up with staff again. So the next two statuses are very similar to our plantings, but they're unique instead to our propagation items. So split garden status is entered for a propagation item if there are remaining plants in the greenhouse. So in this example, we have a mass of 30 Collinsonia that were split from this propagation item in the greenhouse and then planted in bed 191. When I received a plant change from our entrance garden horticulturist, I created a planting item for the new mass that was planted in the garden. And you can see there's a planting item B that corresponds to bed 191. So again, we would run an audit report just to make sure that all of the planting information was submitted. And like the split status, this remains in the item history. So we would just have to sort through the comments again to find out if there were any empty lines. So finally, complete to garden status is entered for a propagation item if all the plants for that item were removed from the greenhouse. So this status also remains in the item history and indicates that this item isn't necessarily dead. It just transitioned out of the greenhouse to a planting item, and the propagation item is now not existing. So I can audit these the same way I do the split and split garden statuses, and we'll sort through the output to see where comments are missing. So like I said, this was a little bit more specific to our processes. So I'm happy to take any questions at this time regarding what we just talked about, and then we'll move on to our next scenario.
If you have a propagation, like all your propagation you're calling A at this point, and if you had a propagation item that was, say, 50, and then you start, then the germination status, and then eventually you're going to have some that are going into B, which is planting. Is there a way that you're connecting? Let's say you planted out five plants. How do you connect which propagation line that they are related to?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I don't have a visual for this, but we use the item reference field. So you can see it in the item properties here. It's like maybe the 5th line down, item ref. So there's a drop down there that should have every item listed that's a part of this accession. So every time we create a new item from another item, let's say a propagation, we'll select whichever item that came from, if that makes sense, so that there's a record of like linking it back to its parent item.
Got it. That makes great sense. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm not sure how clear that was, but I wish I had made a slide for that because that's really important. All right, we'll move on. And here's the discussion questions that I have for this greenhouse to garden scenario. So we'll come back to these again at the end. So maybe pick one that you're going to think about a little bit more so we have a good discussion. So number one, there's a lot going on with our signouts. What can we do to limit the number of statuses that are being used or simplify our workflow? How often would you recommend running audit reports? And then how does your garden manage plant movement into and out of the greenhouse? We're curious just to see how you might do it differently. All right, so the final scenario I want to discuss is something we really haven't worked out completely in our operations. So in the past, we conducted a complete greenhouse inventory about twice a year. In more recent years, this has been replaced by the maintenance of a live greenhouse inventory where plant numbers are updated accurately and continuously as events take place in the greenhouse, such as repottings, splits, exchanges, or plants being moved from one place to another. Mass is often used in the garden as a planting number once things are planted out, but we've stopped using it in the greenhouse unless indicating an initial number of seed. So the main benefit of this live inventory for us is each week when our greenhouse manager generates the plant availability list. He knows the exact numbers, he knows that they're accurate and can be forecasted to horticulture staff for planting out. The biggest downside of this process is that it requires more attention to detail in the moment. So while we consider this to be pretty accurate, I still find discrepancies quite often. So I don't know how accurate it actually is. So on the screen here, in this example, 2 plants were sent to a nursery. You can see in the item comments, 2 plants were sent to a nursery as an exchange, but 3 were subtracted from the previous total number of plants. So where did this other plant go? Did it die? Did 3 plants actually get sent rather than 2? We won't know. We will never know unless we figure out how to make our process a little more accurate. So like I mentioned earlier, much of our greenhouse data is recorded on paper or an Excel sheet and then later entered into the database. So one solution I can see being helpful is using a tablet to cut out the middle step of entering data on paper. So we could have the tablet with us, or the greenhouse staff could have it with them while they're in the process of moving plants around. We have a dedicated tablet for the greenhouse. We just haven't fully integrated it into our daily operations. All right, so we have been using Floria as well, but I was told today, which is very exciting for me, that you can use IrisBG, the full database, on a tablet as long as it's operating with Microsoft. So I think that's something exciting. I'm really interested to hear how this group uses IrisBG in the field and what suggestions you might have. So here are 2 questions we can ask for this live inventory scenario. So we'll come back to these in the next slide for further discussion. So do you track any plant numbers in a rigorous way like this live inventory? If so, how do you limit errors in number that seem to occur quite often for us? And number 2, does your garden use IrisBG on a tablet to utilize the database in the field? And how does this help your efficiency?